Paris, la ville lumière, the city of lights. La Tour Eiffel, les Champs-Élysées, Place de la Concorde. How shall I put it? Living here is like working every day with a beautiful woman. After a while, she becomes like your sister. But this film is not about Paris. It's influenced by it because I've spent over 2 decades here, but my past is elsewhere. And this is a voyage towards that past. Across the Atlantic and back 4 decades. One day, at my home in the 20th arrondissement of Paris, I received an email that had the allure of a spam. I opened it. It was an invitation, a call from the past. The letter read, "Don't forget, the Bethesda-Chevy Chase reunion of the class of '68 is coming. Don't miss it. After 40, any invitation is welcome." The reunion took place one warm October weekend. It started on a Friday afternoon with a tour of the school, which is located in Bethesda, Maryland, just a 10-minute drive from the capital city of Washington, D.C.
Hello, do I know you?
I'm Sarah Shapiro.
I'm Terry Kirch.
Hi, hi.
Hey. This is Amy.
Oh, and
My
a brand new
wife,
baby. Hi.
How are you?
Patty Mack.
I'm Patty Mack. My husband Steve.
Hi, Steve. Oh my God, you get the Bravery Award for coming.
Look what my mother has in my bedroom at home.
What grade are we? 6th grade.
And I recognize you too. You look the same, Sarah. Just the hair's a little lighter.
My hair's exactly the same as mine.
I'm Allison.
I remember you, Allison.
Meininger,
Yes.
right?
Hi, Patty. Linda Lobenstein.
Oh, yes.
I don't look the same anymore. No, the hair's all gone.
Yeah, but the face is the same.
Well, it feels pretty weird to be back at BCC since I haven't been here almost 40 years and 2 months. So being back and walking around the perimeter was kind of a strange experience, sort of out of body.
In what sense was it out of body?
Well, I saw myself at the graduation in 1968 in the very exact same benches that are there for the football, for the football field. And it's just, I just remember, here I am and there I was, 40 years.
I loved high school, but it's very different. The school's different from what I went to.
In what way?
Just they've remodeled it. It seems more high-tech, and it's not as homey. I mean, the old BCC was like home for us for so many years.
When I look back on those days, I am not nostalgic for my days in BCC, not overly. They definitely were not the best days of my life.
When I come back here, my immediate thought is sitting in these stands, watching Tom playing football, and fun, just a lot of fun, just a carefree time in my life.
How does it feel being back at BCC?
Pretty gruesome.
I have a selective memory about high school. I remember Molly's thighs. She was PC, pre-cellulite, and she would wear skirts that stopped inches below her firm buttocks. I remember Kay, who because of the miracle of the alphabet was my lab partner in biology. And most importantly, I remember being too stupid to capitalize on these opportunities my youth had offered me.
Try to imagine. I know you can't imagine, but imagine fast forward 40 years from now. No, 41 years. Yeah. And then you're here with all your high school friends.
All my buddies.
You can't even fathom it.
Yeah, I actually can't.
No,
I might not even be in the country when I'm 40. Wait.
40
50,
years,
oh,
41 years from now. Yeah,
Glad I enjoyed
right.
Miller.
Nice meeting you.
Bye-bye.
Were you in our class?
I most certainly was.
And what's your name?
Well, it was Joseph. Now it's Joanna.
Oh, okay. That's why I don't recognize
That's
you.
right.
Anyway,
Put on
nice.
some changes.
Right, right.
A few things were added and a few things were subtracted, as the song goes.
Yes.
I was very isolated. I did not have many friends. I knew something was wrong with me, and I didn't know what the heck it was. I only knew that something wasn't right with me, and that tended to make me angry.
Good. I just wanted to make sure that you notice in the C building you can't get from one floor to the other because the C building is older. These are the new standards on this side. But this is all new. So there are staircases in the four corners of the building.
I can't really say I was attached to my school or my classmates, nor they to me. But being within the walls of BCC, I did feel a tinge of nostalgia.
You'll see East-West Highway. On your right is the A building where the cafeteria is still at the very bottom, and there was the remember the breezeway down on the first floor connected these two buildings.
I remember a lot of activity, a lot of sounds, the lockers clanking, that kind of thing as you walk down the hall. And getting between classes was, wow, you had to sometimes sprint to get from one end of the campus to another. It was a huge place.
After its $29 million facelift, BCC seems more like a country club than my own private Alcatraz. I kept one friend from school, Peter, whom I followed as he toured the campus.
Now, I remember that the roof there because of the windows, but this is all new, so in '68, when I was here, obviously this is a whole new section. But that top part's the old part. In fact, the geometry class is probably up in there somewhere. Dreaded geometry class.
I can't believe you can remember that. I can't remember where any classes were.
In fact, my advanced algebra and trig class is up there. All the math classes are in the in the high enclosed areas. My advanced algebra and trig teacher would be right up here. He did a slide up here, and he had transparencies, and he did all the problems. And I was like right about, I was like right here, asleep. Or my head like this.
I, at an early stage in my education, conceived a real loathing of teachers, and there were very few exceptions to that. You mentioned Miss Hurd, who was my senior English teacher, who I have always recalled as the kind of avatar of a bad English teacher who was both uninteresting, relatively uninformed, mostly interested in maintaining discipline in the classroom, and left no imprint on me whatsoever except some memories of her fairly gruesome personality. Not all teachers were like her, but she was more typical than most. I did ask about a history teacher I had the year before who had accused me of plagiarism at the time, and I've never forgotten that. Because on the one hand, it was a compliment to me that she thought I had copied something I'd written from elsewhere, but I can remember the impotence I felt trying to explain to her that I hadn't plagiarized this. I had actually written this myself, and I can still remember the way she responded to me, which was, well, you may have. And I can still see the look on her face, and to this day, I want to kick her in the shins.
In 1968, Bethesda was a sleepy suburban town. There were 2 movie theaters, 2 bowling alleys, a few hamburger joints, some Italian and seafood restaurants. It was easy to park, and one could cross town in a few minutes. And there were more used bookstores than skyscrapers.
Then I might remember.
time that we usually set aside for you all to tell stories if you want.
We met in chemistry class where I was sitting in the front of the row and Tom was in the back of the row. And after the first date, he found out that I was taking attendance in chemistry. And he just casually mentioned it was his second time in chemistry. And he really didn't want to stay in class, so would I just mind marking him present while he was out playing basketball?
And I still got a B in the class.
I may have done that, and I felt
Thanks
so
to
guilty.
Mrs. Howe.
I was so guilty, and our teacher was Mr. Edwards. And after we married and we got our first apartment, we came out of the apartment, we were going to work, we were newly married, we were both going to our jobs, and we stepped out of the apartment, and who is in the building next to us but Mr. Edwards? I apologized, and I fessed up.
He wanted to know who I was.
From third grade on, I was always looking for, every time I went out on a date, I had a picture in my mind of how I was going to bond with that date, chemically or otherwise. And when I went out with my wife on our first date, by the end of the date, I knew I was going to marry her.
BCC in 1968 was over 95% white. There was one black on the football team and no black cheerleaders. African Americans sang the best songs and cleaned our homes. We would learn finally that they were just as smart and just as stupid as we were.
I mean, I was successful in some ways in high school, not so successful in other ways. And high school can be like that. You can make some progress and at the same time feel like you're really hemmed in by sort of the institution, by the people you know, and of course there's a whole anxiety-inducing thing around going to college. So you're growing up, but you're obviously not grown up. You're going somewhere, but you're not there yet. So I have very mixed feelings about it.
I had been very heavy in my early years of high school, and I lost between my sophomore and junior year, that's between the time that I stopped going to private school and went to public school, I lost 65 pounds. So my life changed dramatically from being a chubby girl in a private school wearing a uniform to being a girl like the other girls at BCC wearing civilian clothes, wearing regular clothes, not wearing a uniform.
I like print shop, except for the fact that some of the guys didn't particularly like the idea of a kid who read Shakespeare. A couple of my Shakespeare books got cut up in the cutting press. But they were sort of the village idiots, and I took them that way. I didn't care. I had very few friends here at school. I was pretty much a quiet loner, just the way I was. I moved so much over the course of my life, from the time I was a very small child right up through college, that you either took me like I stood, or to hell with you.
It was a tough time, late teens, problems with parents. My mother had made one of those wonderful decisions because my brother had not done well with his driving privilege. She had decided that I would not get my driver's license until I was 17. And as a consequence, I didn't have the mobility, I couldn't date. And it was tough for me. I was in the habit of making intelligent teenage decisions, and in my junior year of high school, I guess I think I failed everything by midterm. I was not going. It was a statement to my parents that I wasn't happy, but they weren't listening particularly well. I ended up being 526 out of 630 in the graduating class standing.
This is considered a very desirable area. It's close to Washington. It's close to a lot of jobs. It's got a good school system. It's safe. So a lot of people would like to live here, and people are willing to pay extra in order to live in this area. I would say my house is worth maybe 10% less than it was a year ago, but it hasn't really gone down much more than that. If you drive around this neighborhood where we are right now, you'll see that probably half of the original houses have been torn down in the last 15 years and replaced by houses that are 2 or 3 times as big. The land is worth $700,000. And with a $700,000 piece of land, it's appropriate to build a house that's worth $2 million, and that's what you have here now.
I could never afford to live in Bethesda today. The prices have skyrocketed, and I feel like when I was growing up in this area, everybody knew everybody. It had more of a small town feeling. Now it's become what I call Yuppieville. They've torn down all the cute little houses that had character. They've totally built up everything. It's become almost like a concrete jungle. I'm glad they finally, I think they put some stops on it, but the Bethesda I knew is no longer here. I miss it.
I miss it too sometimes. In '68, at 18, I left Bethesda and moved up north to New York City. Everything was possible. For Margaret and her family, 15 in all, everything was possible also. It just took a little more imagination.
Getting around with my family in vehicles was always interesting. Thank God that at the time, seatbelts were not obligatory. They weren't even in most cars. And we always had station wagons, the wooden-sided ones. My father really liked those, country squires. And we were able to use a cottage at Scotland Beach, which is on the Chesapeake, in the summers. And when we would drive down there, we would be shoved into the car, and we also had to have all of our goods and, you know, the food and everything to take with us. And people would look in our car and see just a sea of faces, and we would have to put our hands up, more than 2 of us, to show how many were in there. For dinners, we all had assigned seats. Lefties had certain seats so that they could have their elbows free, that kind of thing. And get into your place, and then we had our little ritual of sliding in to the seat, you know, close to the table, closer to the table. And then at meals, we had our family traditions and family practices. Our father would sit at one end of the table, mother at the other, as I said, and mom would serve the plates from the youngest child to the oldest, and my father was served last.
I can remember at a very early age being very interested in Europe and European history. I can remember when I was 7 years old, the Queen of England came to Washington, and I persuaded my sister, who was many years older than me, to take me out to the University of Maryland to the football game that weekend because she and Prince Philip were there. I was a sort of incipient little Anglophile at age 7.
College Park, Maryland is in a festive mood, for a Queen's likeness decorates a football program. And a Queen in person makes a triumphal entry into a football stadium. A sellout crowd of 43,000 cheers Queen Elizabeth and her consort Prince Philip, very special guests of the University of Maryland. Governor McKeldin and his family escort the royal couple to special seats. And for Maryland fans, the presence of Elizabeth and Philip proves as exciting as the game which follows. Football on a fall afternoon, an American institution.
I conceived a real passion for the past. I suppose as a natural conservative, I fear the future, I tolerate the present, and revere the past.
So where is he coming from, Germany?
Yeah, he's coming from Germany.
Oh, yeah, I read that.
I'm glad you're alive. How are you?
Hi, Bob Rosenbluth.
Hey, Bob, how are you?
Okay, I'm doing all right.
Good.
It's a nice comment. I'm glad you're alive. That's a good greeting.
Well, nobody could find him.
I was an outsider at BCC since I transferred there my junior year. Most of my classmates had spent 12 years together.
You dated that lifeguard after senior year?
After senior year. And he was the hunk.
Oh, yes, he was.
Some of the BCC kids have known each other since kindergarten. I went to nursery school with some of the students that I graduated with. I mean, I've known them, not that I remember, but I knew them literally since I was 3. And the lived in the same neighborhoods with each other. I mean, we really have a shared experience. And that value of talking to people with whom you share so much, but have gone on to do various different things, and coming back then and having discussions and conversations about where you are at your stage of life, is even more valuable, I think, for a BCC reunion.
I guess I should put on my little
I used to work with your uncle, Stanley. Did you really?
Oh, I lost my my senior yearbook a long time ago.
Yeah, I didn't lose mine. I threw it out.
Once a cheerleader, always a cheerleader. We're gonna be Blair.
Unfortunately, I was a bit ditzy in high school, and politics didn't affect me. I didn't pay attention to politics. I was more concerned with what makeup I was wearing and how my hair was going to look.
Back in our year, there was a president, Lyndon Johnson, that we all used to listen to on radio and TV. Phil, you want to come up and do your Lyndon Johnson, please? He did it on the morning announcements one day, if you recall.
Well, I was president 39 years ago, so any of you who remember when I was in the White House are now closing in on Social Security, so I'm so glad that you're here tonight. Thank you so much.
Lyndon Johnson was president in 1968. His achievements in civil rights and in Medicare would be overshadowed by his expansion of the Vietnam War.
The civil rights movement was probably the first thing that radicalized me, was understanding that in America, like, people were being discriminated against because of the color of their skin, and there was violence, and there were all these, like, terrible things were happening to people simply because they were a different skin. That obviously wasn't right.
On April 4th, 1968, Senator Robert Kennedy was in Indiana campaigning for president when he learned that Martin Luther King had been assassinated.
I have some very sad news for all of you, and that is that Martin Luther King was shot and was killed tonight in Memphis. What we need in the United States is not division. What we need in the United States is not hatred. What we need in the United States is not violence and lawlessness, but is love and wisdom and compassion toward one another. Feeling of justice toward those who still suffer within our country, whether they be white or whether they be black.
10 weeks after this speech, just before the end of high school, Senator Kennedy was shot in Los Angeles.
And then the whole Vietnam War thing seemed to symbolize and crystallize all the things that were not quite right about American society. It made me quite radical about my views about American capitalism, about American society, about the leadership of America, and feeling like it just wasn't right, and something should be done about it. And what exactly should replace it, and how to replace it, who knows? But I think, like a lot of people, I was kind of seeking and reaching for something that was significantly better, and that there were just a lot of lies and a lot of hypocrisy behind the way America had been presented to me when I grew up.
I grew up in a very, very left-wing family here, and an acutely politically conscious family. My mother was, in fact, literally a politician. And so being on the left, I suppose, was my inheritance at the time. And of course, when you're young, when you're real young, you tend not to rebel. And then when you get a little older, if you do rebel, well, the rebellion for me was to move from left to right. But I think it's a little deeper than that. I do remember 1968 quite vividly in the sense of the Columbia strike and the whatever you want to call it that occurred in France, the revolt. And I remember vividly the two marches in Paris, the anti-Gaullist and the pro-Gaullist march. But At that point in my life, I was very politically ambivalent. And I can remember feeling a certain sympathy with the Gaullist March, with André Malraux and Josephine Baker and all. And I remember thinking at the time, you know, I probably shouldn't be thinking this way, but that's where my feelings are at the moment. So I do remember a certain ambivalence about those events. There was a movie that came out around that time called Oh, What a Lovely War, which was set in World War I, which had a lot of slapstick scenery of the First World War, and which I, for some reason, thought was amusing. And I thought what I would do is just use a bunch of totally differing elements. A car that doesn't belong under these circumstances, everybody in hybrid uniforms that are related to nothing, and then you have the general shaking hands with the troops, and then you have the same people coming around to shake hands with the same person. So it was just a kind of pathetic attempt at surreal comedy.
I would have to say that my family upbringing gave me some good skills for the military, because you could say essentially I was raised in a squad. A squad in most Army units has 15 people or so, and that's what we were. And it's often broken down into two teams. You have an A team and a B team in a squad, and I was kind of like the B team squad leader. I realized we had the big kids in my family, those were the older kids, and the little kids. I didn't really belong to either group. I was immediately in the middle, completely in the middle of the family, in the exact middle. And so when I wanted to, I could belong to the big kids. And then when they wanted me to get out of their hair, I was one of the little kids. But you did learn to share. You learned the importance of getting along. You learned to compromise. But you also learned to step forward and speak up for yourself, or you were going to get run over.
Perhaps 6 of my classmates fought in Vietnam. I was lucky to not get drafted. To this day, I cannot say what I would have done had my name been called.
I had 2 brothers that served in the Vietnam War, and I had an oldest brother. He had gone to Canada to study for the priesthood, and then eventually stopped studying for the priesthood, and he stayed in Canada. He was a conscientious objector, and for a while there was a huge scandal in my family because his draft notice came and he didn't come back. So that was the oldest brother. The third oldest in the family, the second brother who got his draft notice, he went to Vietnam and served in Vietnam and came home. He was an infantryman. And then the third brother who was drafted, he went to Vietnam. Before he went to Vietnam, though, he became an officer. He went through OCS and Special Forces. The Green Berets were brand new back then. And so he became a Green Beret. And he was killed in Vietnam.
Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. Oh,
I wanted to go to Vietnam. I mean, it was the event of the decade. You know, I wanted my war stories, and I wanted to be a part of it. I wanted to see what it was about. And so I called back to Washington and asked my mother to see if she had any strings she could pull to see that I would go to Vietnam and not to Germany. And as it turned out, 97% of the people went to Germany, but the air traffic controls were in short supply, so they weren't going to be diverted anyway. So I ended up in Vietnam. It was an experience. I never really feared for my life. I wasn't a combatant. The war was sort of fought like a regular job. They had rush hour in the morning and rush hour in the afternoon when everybody got the same release time. It was kind of humorous that a war would be fought that way. I think the film that sort of resonated me in the kind of the insanity of the whole thing was Apocalypse Now. Not that the scenes were realistic or even representative of my experience, but it's just the feel of it, this kind of a surrealistic, unreal way that the war was conducted. I remember I was on a midnight to 6 shift in the control tower, and I had a call from a helicopter out in the Delta someplace, and they had a sampan unloading supplies at 3 o'clock in the morning. Well, there was a curfew. Obviously, their NVA or you know, Victor Charlie at that hour in the morning, no legitimate commerce would be taking place. And he was trying to get permission to fire on them. You would think that that would be self-evident, but no. You had the rules of engagement required you to have permission to fire. And when I left the shift at 6 o'clock in the morning, he didn't have permission, at least not through us. Maybe they arranged it on a separate radio channel or something, but I mean, that's sort of how the war was. You know, you discover the enemy unloading goods, but it's politically incorrect to fire upon them. Is that any way to fight a war? My recollections, when I left Vietnam, I was glad about 2 things. One was that I didn't have to kill anybody, and secondly, that I had all my fingers and toes. For myself, I have no stomach for war. The people that suffer would just as soon be home with their families. You know, if you want to go around killing commies, you've got a problem, because they're just everyday people.
Both candidates that are running for office this year are profess to be religious and Christian, and that their moral and family fibers are built on that rock. And so we're encouraged by that, and we hope that that God will be back in the creeds and the classrooms, and you know, maybe turn back time a little bit.
I don't think we're being exploited by politics because of our religious beliefs, because of the fact that, I mean, the side that, and I might as well say the side I prefer has a Christian conservative, a Christian, to be frank with you, all 4 of them claim to be Christians. So to me, if they claim to be Christians, then they'll be acting out their you know, you can't just be a Christian. You either believe that Jesus is your Lord and Savior, or you or you don't.
God desires to be alone with us as much as we do with him. Scripture says if we draw close to him, he draws close to us. God loves us and wants that time with us. One quick announcement before we move out of here today. Next week, we're going to kick off a new sermon series, Politically Incorrect. Interesting times we're in right now. Anywhere you turn, there's either a financial mess or economy mess or things about politics. What's our response to that as Christians? Joe's going to take a really thoughtful look at some very controversial issues. And what is the role of our government in influencing what goes on in our culture? What is our role as believers in influencing people around us?
I'm just not the type of person that believes in any kind of homosexuality or transgender. It's because of my religious beliefs, I could say, because I'm a Christian and I believe what the Bible says and I listen to what my God tells me through the words.
My Savior loves, my Savior lives, my Savior's always there for me. My God, he was, my God, he is, my God is always gonna be. My Savior loves, my Savior lives, my Savior's always there for me. My God, he was, my God, he is, my God is always gonna be.
Your father finds what little stash you have of female clothing, and it all winds up at the burn bag at his office. And I get a very stern lecture about how I'm driving my poor mother nuts. I didn't know what to tell him. I really didn't. The last Father's Day that I had with him, which was in 2004, in March. No, I think it was June. Anyway, yeah, June. And I brought him a card from his son. And I brought him a card from his daughter. And I gave him the one from his son, and I asked him what he would have thought of raising a daughter instead of a son. And he said that would have been a disaster. So, needless to say, he didn't get the one from his daughter. We were never able to truly resolve that issue between us, and that hurts.
You never struck me as feminine. You were just another guy, you know. People didn't remark me. I didn't so much remark you, but I remember you. And so that's why you must have really been suppressing something?
I was trying to hide, to fit in, to be one of the boys. And I wasn't. I really, really wasn't. And in 1990, I'd reached a point that if I didn't change, I was gonna die. It had reached that point in my life. I chose to change. My changes began over time as very gradual. Things like getting my ears pierced, things like getting on hormones, and letting my body change slowly over time. My father never asked me about why I had my ears pierced. I didn't tell him. But I knew that certain steps would be irrevocable, that once they were done or started, there was no turning around, going back. And so I had to learn. I took 16 years from the day that I chose to change to the day that I was wheeled into surgery in Trinidad, Colorado. So I had 16 years to get ready to become Joanna.
I don't remember protests in high school, but becoming more involved in it, somewhat involved in protests at University of Maryland. Friends of mine were in the National Guard and had to guard us and help to quell the rioting in University of Maryland and the riots on Route 1, I remember.
When I was an undergraduate, I was an intern and then a speechwriter at the Democratic National Committee in Washington. And I was there during the invasion of Cambodia and the great student march on Washington at the time. And it actually, not that I mentioned this to anybody there, but all of those events pushed me ever rightward.
We just talked big. We talked radical. We like to talk about things and kind of analyze how messed up things were. And of course, like a lot of people at the time, we were caught up in sort of, there was a political revolution, but then there was also the counterculture revolution. So a lot of us were very attracted to the whole culture around smoking marijuana, psychedelic drugs, that whole kind of turn on, tune in, drop out kind of thing. There was a real attraction to that rejection of the so-called bourgeois lifestyle. So I went down to Washington, I went to the May Days, I went to the big mobs against the war, and I would join the anti-imperialist contingent because I was more radical than most of them. And yeah, we had ourselves a time. And eventually, I took quite a while to get through college, which is another long story, but I myself eventually joined a revolutionary organization called the Revolutionary Union, which is a Maoist organization. So I went through a bit of a Maoist phase in early part of the 70s before I concluded that perhaps a peasant-based revolution was not the ideal strategy for the United States, or at any rate, someone who had generated a peasant-based revolution was probably not the best model for the U.S., and that in general, a proletarian revolution in the United States was a preposterous notion.
Just through the first show, because then you can break. In January, it'll be 35 years that I've worked at the Dancing Crab. It's pretty pathetic, but...
Why is it pathetic?
Well, because there's really no financial remuneration for the years I've put in there. But I've enjoyed it. I've met a lot of really nice people. I love crabs. They're called beautiful swimmers. These back fins in the water, they're very, very fast. On land, they're a little slow, but they're still pretty quick. They get away from the cooks every now and then. I enjoy waitressing because it is physical. I could never sit at a desk for 8 hours a day.
You work your ass off, and it's not enough.
I felt the economy changing in the winter because people just weren't going out as much. And then I spent most of the spring and summer, because it's a crab house, we're pretty seasonal, catching up with what I couldn't pay in the winter, and now I'm really starting to feel it. My credit score's dropped, I'm late on all my bills. It's really, really becoming depressing. I feel that I didn't pursue probably the right profession, but I'll just try to get a second job to help supplement the income I don't have coming in right now. I've always been financially challenged. My mother always said that God will provide, so I always kind of hold on to that little hope that, and somehow I've managed to muddle through.
If God doesn't provide, neither will the American government. On September 11, 2001, Margaret was working at the Pentagon, a half-hour drive from Bethesda.
I had picked up a banana, a package of little box of Wheaties, and some milk, and I was in the process of pouring coffee from the big coffee machine when all of a sudden the building I heard a big noise and the building just shook. I started hearing screaming, people running, and I said, okay, we need to evacuate. Everybody needs to make sure we know who was here today, and who are they, and we'll need to lock up the office, and then let's get out of here. It turns out I was about 100, maximum of 100 yards, not even, probably closer to 100 feet, from where the nose of the plane ended up in the Pentagon. To this day, I still wonder why I wasn't one of those whose first inclination was to run towards the impact zone to try to help people, but I didn't do that. I tried to calm people around me and then get out, and then, as I say, my next instinct was to make sure I could let my mother know that I was okay.
I did not believe that there would be an African-American candidate for president or nominee, or even, eventually, if he's elected, be president. I never would have thought it. I remember back in 1968, there was like the Poor People's Campaign in 1968, and we wore buttons here in BCC that were a button that was half white, half black, says, "I have a dream, one America." I still have that button, actually. And we wore that button. I would never have thought that 40 years later that we'd have a candidate or a nominee or even a president within our lifetime. Someday, but I didn't think it would be in my lifetime.
Recognizing Sarah, because absolutely none of this would have happened. None of this would have happened without Sarah.
She's got grandchildren, so she knows how to talk over a crowd.
Oh, I can. What makes a reunion great is y'all. If y'all want to come, there's nothing worth coming to. So the best thing to do is keep in touch.
Big cheer for the heroes of the year. They are the barons of BCC.
I don't think old, so I try to, in fact, my dad just told me, asked when, he's 86. He asked when I was going to stop dressing like a teenager, and I told him when I grow up.
I certainly don't feel like things are over. I mean, I'm, quite excited about the work I do, and I'm always sort of thinking of new projects to do in this area, and we're, as we've been discussing, on the verge of a potentially very substantial, very significant change in the American political scene, which is going to make a lot of things possible that just weren't the last 8 years.
I'm starting to feel in some ways out of touch a bit when I find myself getting a little bit less than excited about learning how to use an iPod or something like that. I'm somewhat forcing myself to continue to do that kind of thing. But in terms of feeling old, especially in relation to young people, no.
It went by very quickly. I think if it wasn't for my religion, it would be depressing.
Do we feel old? Some days yes, and some days no. We have 5 grandchildren, and sometimes when we're with the grandchildren and with other grandparents, there are times when I feel like, wow, I'm sort of that generation now, where we're starting to have grandchildren, and sometimes in those instances I feel old. But on Saturday night when we were with other people our age and celebrating high school, I felt like I was 18.
So I feel very blessed in the fact that even though I'm 58 years old right now, I don't feel 58. When I was 29, I had my body felt like an old man, and I was sitting there trying to figure out what am I going to do when I become 58. It was like I'm going to be in all kinds of pain, but if nothing else, I feel better now than I ever did in my younger days.
I don't feel that as old as I am. I don't quite know why that is. I mean, I realize I am to the outside world far more elderly than I feel, but no, I think of myself as being about in my early 30s for some reason.
Do you feel that your life started when you had the...
Well, do I think I'm almost 2 years old now? Actually, over 2, because October 10th was when I had my surgery. So technically, yes, I have a birthday in July and I have a birthday in October. But no, I don't feel like I'm 2 years old. I just feel like I'm a complete human being finally. That's really the thing. Yep, guess so. To feel balanced and whole in yourself.
In case somebody didn't announce this earlier, it's advised to refrain from taking the brown acid that's circulating.
Going back again. If we didn't look good one way, we're going to look better the next.
A few weeks after the reunion, America elected Barack Obama president. For many, it was a rayon of sunlight after years of darkness. Often I think about returning to the USA. And then I say, not yet. Bob Dylan sang, I was so much older then, I'm younger than that now. Well, I'm older than that now.